It's for guest preachers, just in case. So I got to be really careful what I say. That's right. Oh. So I've been a pastor for covenant pastor for over 30 years. I'm taking a couple years off to do some writing and working on a couple of books, and using my trying to raise a couple of shekels by doing things such as this, and also driving bus for the Beaverton School District, and also teaching a theater class in the Beaverton District. But again, thanks so much for letting me come to be with you. So our reading today for the message comes to us from Romans 8. Be reading verse 28 for us. Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Church, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The earliest memories that she has are just these images of things like ladies dressed in incredible outfits with plumes and feathers, and people leaping through hoops of fire. She even had a baby elephant for a pet when the circus that her parents were connected with in North Africa, their adult elephant, a female, they were going to have her killed because she was going rogue. She didn't want to let any humans near her little baby, but little Lydia was only about 5 or so, and the mama elephant didn't mind this little girl coming, and so the circus gave the baby elephant to Lydia, and that was her pet. To this day, she still collects little elephant figurines. Lydia grew up in a world that most of us would think of as a fantasy childhood. Her parents were European. She was from Germany. She spoke German. But her name, Lydia, didn't match the way she looked. She had jet black hair that came down, and she and her sister stood out from the crowd. It was because her mother was blonde-haired, blue-eyed German. Her father, culturally German, spoke German, but was 100% ethnically Chinese. Interracial family. But her parents were, if you ever heard the name vaudeville, this is a European style of vaudeville. So in the 1930s, they traveled all over Europe and all over Northern Africa, sometimes connecting with circuses, sometimes doing acts on their own. The father, for a while, had an act called the Wong family, because that was his last name, and they would do things like he would leap through hoops of knives, and they would perform and so forth. And the circus she was with for a while in Ethiopia actually worked her into the act. The mother elephant immediately on her own picked Lydia up with her trunk in affection. And so Lydia loved it, and they worked it into the act. She has memories of walking up to camels and riding camels to the pyramids in Egypt. And she was homeschooled in those days. Her sister was a year younger. But when her sister got old enough, the father said, we really should go back to Germany and get you into a regular school. They didn't have the internet in those days. It was the middle 30s. They didn't know that the hometown that they were from, Munich, was the home ground of a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. They did not know that an interracial marriage would not be welcome in the Germany that had been growing during the time that they had been on the road for several years. But they went back to Germany, and when she went back, she was called by the last name of Liebig, and she thought, that's strange, I'm not a Liebig, I'm a Wong. But her mother just said, just go with it. So Lydia continued to work as a kid, as kids do, and started into school. As the war broke out, schools started to get bombed. Imagine if you're in school and all the places are bombed, and so you get to travel with your teacher. It's what they did in those days in Munich. Her parents were entertainers, and so they would get gigs in different places. And when the actual war broke out over the border of Germany into France, her parents were in Paris at the time, and their girls were back in Munich. Now, even though these two parents did not go along with all that Aryan business and all that stuff that Hitler was preaching against every other race other than being pure German, the French authorities said, well, you have a German passport, so they were considered enemy. And they were put into jail. And the parents pleaded with the authorities, please let us go back into Germany and get our girls out. And so a deal was made. The father had to remain in jail, and the mother was allowed on the last repatriation train. If you've ever seen pictures of World War II of trains with hundreds of people hanging on the outside, that's how she went, grabbing a hold, suitcase in one hand, and grabbing a hold of the train all the way back from Paris, all the way back to Munich. In Munich, it began 2 years for her, of Lydia's mother, for her to have really hell, and I'm not swearing here. It was very, very difficult. Having children did not look like the expectation of the dominant culture. She would often hide her girls when they were home, and relatives that did at least love them would try to, just shh, don't say anything. And there was never any talk about her father. She had no idea where he was. The mother worked for the Nazi version of what we call the Red Cross. But then things kept getting worse, and Lydia's fantasy childhood began to turn into one of darkness and horror. Unknown to her, there was a group called the Gestapo. It was the secret police. If you know anything about Nazi Germany, Hitler had a number of organizations. The SS, which was the high elite, I've seen their uniforms. Their medallion was a skull and crossbone. They didn't mess around with who they were. They were evil. And the Gestapo was that secret police, an arm of the SS, and they would go out, and they found Lydia's mother, and she was very beautiful. She was a world traveler, and so they wanted her to use her physical beauty to get in romantically, sexually with people in the underground movement so they could condemn people. And she refused. So they gave her a choice. They either kill her children or she was to take poison. She chose the poison. Lydia was about 11 at the time. I remember coming home and seeing her mother sick, and within a few hours she died. And part of the confusion of that time was 2 days before that, an announcement had been made that she was to get married. And in Lydia's mind, she already had a daddy. Her mother was already married. To this day, she's not sure what all that was about. From a child's perspective, you don't understand. Perhaps the relatives are trying to get the mother hooked up with a nice German-looking guy to keep things from being too noticed. So Lydia and her sister moved in with her step-grandmother and her grandfather. She said she got to know the bombs really well. You could tell what kind of bombs they were by the sound. There were percussion bombs. Those were horrible. Her best friend she saw blown up with a percussion bomb. Percussion bombs, there could be a bomb that would hit outside the doors of this church. I would be here, those windows might be knocked out, and Greg might be killed from the inside, imploded, and I would be fine. Strange, it's just these waves of power that come through. But then there were the incendiary bombs. They would hit, and you've got a few seconds, and then they explode, kind of like sending napalm or fire over. Her grandfather would listen, and if he could tell it was going to be a percussion bomb, everyone would herd down into their apartment, down into the basement. But if it was an incendiary bomb, he would send everybody downstairs, and he would go up into the attic, and when the bomb would come through the ceiling, he would pull it out and stick it into sand so that when it would go off, it wouldn't burn the building. Some of those things you remember when you're a child, She remembered, as she got older, how kids are, rules, stupid, And the air raid with siren would go off, and adults would say, "You have to go hide quickly," and she wouldn't want to. And one day, she and her sister decided to just take their time. And the bombs really came, and they almost got killed. They had to jump into an area that had already been a crater that had been created from a previous attack. Now her schools, all the schools in Munich were bombed, all of them. And so all the students were traveling with their teachers. She and her sister Sonia traveled from school to school with all girls. They would travel from one castle to one estate to one different place out in the country, from one place to another. And unknown to her, because of her ethnic background, she and her sister were destined to go to Dachau concentration camp. Now, if you know anything about the concentration camps, and I have to say this because I discover a lot of people today, and I work in the schools, there are a lot of kids that don't know our history. And the concentration camps were places there were several thousand of them within the areas that the Germans had conquered during World War II, where they put anyone that did not fit with their system. So Jewish people, homosexual people, gypsies, political prisoners, anyone who would not fit with their view of the perfect human race. And Dachau was just outside Munich. It was the training ground. Every commandant of every concentration camp went through Dachau to learn their trade. It was part of the campus of the SS headquarters. It was brutal. And what often would happen is you'd have one main camp and several small ones around. She was destined to go to one of those where the women would go. And her teacher kind of understood this. And so when the authorities would come looking for the papers of all the students, she would send Lydia and Sonia out to go for a walk. Go for a walk for a while. And go out in those woods over there and go bring me some pine cones or bring me some gentian, little wildflowers. And so in that way, the teacher actually put herself at great risk, but she saved the lives of these two girls. Well, the end of the war finally came. In Munich, which had been basically the home headquarters of Adolf Hitler, it was very difficult. People were starving to death by the end of the war. And as you can imagine, rumors would spread quickly about food. And there was a rumor that there was a German resistance group that was going to fight to the death, and that they had a warehouse full of food waiting for that final fight. Well, that resistance group had long since fled, but there actually was a warehouse. And so these two little girls, of course, with hundreds of other Germans that were running to see where this was. And by the time they got there, their little feet had gotten them there. All the adults had already busted the door open and carried stuff away. But there was an outdoor cupboard, a great big tall thing with doors that opened like this. And it was about 6 by 6 inside, and it was filled with nothing but jam in glass containers. And by the time Lydia and Sonia got there, most of the jars were gone. The ones that were left were all over the floor, broken. And so they were down in their ankle deep in jam, going like this, trying to avoid the glass as the American tanks came in. They had been told that the Americans would rape. They didn't even know what that meant, and they would attack. That didn't happen. She remembered that there was could have been maybe a sewer or something originally, but there was a manhole cover on a hole, and down there, as part of the stores in this warehouse, they'd put some of these big, giant, round things of cheese. You ever seen these big wheels of cheese? Thick thing down in this hole, and some people pulled them up, and there was an old German grandmother there. It was just too big for her. She couldn't carry it. An American tank came by, and the American looked down, and he said, "Hold on, grandmother," and he jumps off his tank, takes his bayonet off, the knife, cuts it in half and gives it to her, and she went, and then she goes off, Well, during this time, as the Americans were coming in, Lydia met an American officer. The fact that, by today's standards, that might have been arrested, he was like 30 years older than her, but he was a gentleman, and he was nice, and he treated her well, and he started to go on dates with her, and very smartly always took the grandmother with on every date. And they started talking about getting married. You know, there was in Lydia's blood this sense of travel in other countries, and she just loved other languages, and going to America sounded like a really good thing, but she wanted to know what happened to her father. And so through this American officer, he made his connections. And at the end of World War II, what had happened was the Allies, you know, America and Britain and France and so forth, they all got together. The Germans had moved people all over Europe. It was a mess. It was like bombs had been dropped everywhere. It was just total chaos. And so they made a rule. Either you become a citizen of the country where you are, or you have to go back to the country of your origin. Well, unknown to Lydia, her father was in Italy when the war ended, and he had no intention of being an Italian citizen. He had no connection with Italy at all. So he was forced onto a boat to China. He had been born in China and had emigrated when he was very young. So Lydia's new boyfriend found this out, and they got to Naples, Italy, 2 weeks too late. The boat had already sailed. So one thing led to another, and time went by. She eventually married this guy. And she traveled to the United States. They had to go to 3 different states before they finally found one that would allow her to get married, because she was considered enemy. She was German. Prejudice runs all the time, you know. She got married and had a child. Moved to California, actually, San Pedro, California. And in the 1960s, there was a knock on the door. And here's an American military chaplain standing there. He said, "Excuse me, are you Lydia Liebig?" And she said, "I haven't gone by that name for many years." He said, "Well, I have something for you." And here was a mud-stained letter from her dad. She opened it up, and they began to write, and found out that when he sailed to China, as soon as he got to China and tried to get established there, he was penniless by the time he came there. I mean, he was an entertainer, right? And then the communists took over, and so he fled there to Macau, which is now part of the People's Republic of China. At that time, it was a small island just off the mainland China, and a place of thousands of refugees. And he had fled there, and with him, across the water to Macau, came these old nuns, Catholic nuns, who had devoted their entire life to ministering for Jesus in mainland China. They happened to be German. They were from Munich. That was their home convent. And here they meet this Chinese guy who speaks German. And their bones were getting old in their body, and they can't handle all this refugee stuff and all the shooting and everything, but they had a heart for Jesus, and they wanted to set up a refugee center, so they asked him if he would help them. Well, he wasn't going to do acting anymore. Nobody could pay anything even. And he did love Jesus. He was a very devout Catholic, and so he became one of the main people that supported this refugee center. He did all the gopher work, the making of cots, the mending of wounds, the helping people, translating, and all that type of thing. But it was through these nuns, they wrote to their headquarters, their convent back in Munich, and they made connections, told this man's story, and that's how the connection was with the U.S. military, and eventually the letters back and forth between Lydia and her dad. And then one day, about 3 years after she got the first letter, the letters stopped, and one of the nuns wrote her and said, "Your father passed away." She never had a chance to see him. But during that exchange of letters, he received a picture of her son. Now you got to understand that from a Chinese perspective, the idea of having a male to continue the family, extremely important. And so he went and showed this to these nuns who are now about ready to fall over. You know, I'm over 60 now, and I know what my body feels like. And these ladies were already in their 70s when they fled. And they said, our ministry is really coming to an end, but we will devote ourselves to pray for this child, that he will be protected, but that he will serve God and love Jesus. I know about that child because that child is me. Lydia is my mother. And she did not tell me this until the day I was ordained as a pastor in the covenant denomination. I'm glad she didn't tell me because it would have been kind of hanging over my head, all those years. But she tells me this before I go up to have my hands laid on me. And I swear when those hands were laid on me, I imagined that there were those nuns who now were with Jesus, Those nuns were there too. And my grandfather and other people. Now, the reason I tell you this is because of this verse. Let me read it to you again. And we know that in all things, in wars and catastrophes, in horrible politics and everything else that goes on in our lives, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. My grandfather never knew I would become a pastor through the prayers of these nuns. My grandmother would never have known that she would have had a son through her raising of my mother in the faith, and her husband, that eventually I would come to know Jesus and love God. We actually have similar stories. You think, well, my parents didn't go to part of a circus. Yeah, well, I have the privilege of knowing a little bit of part of my story. One of my fantasies of heaven is having the entire church of God gather together, and for a couple of centuries just hearing all the stories of everything that went on behind the scenes. Amen. This verse tells me that whatever you are going through right now is for good. God is going to bring good out of it. It may be for someone way in the future, or you may be experiencing something that is because someone in the past, maybe hundreds of years from now, was faithful. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And when Paul wrote those words, he just explodes at the end. Because at the end, it really is all about God's love for us and how it is active and working inside us all the time, whether we don't feel well, whether everything in our country falls apart, whether we have money or we do have money, it doesn't matter. As Paul says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? I stand here as a testimony to tell you that these words are true. There is nothing that can get between us and God's love. As Paul ends with, no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.